Everyone, and welcome to the ARCO Forum. I'm Charles Royer, Director of the Institute of Politics, which operates the forum and which is sponsoring this event tonight, along with our Student Advisory Committee of the Institute of Politics. Last week, in front of the Capitol building in Lincoln, Nebraska, Senator Bob Kerrey became the fourth major Democrat to announce for President of the United States. The Boston Globe, in its announcement story, said the following, quote, "Kerry brings to the campaign a war hero's advantage, a record of deposing incumbent Republicans in a heavily Republican state, business acumen that has made him a millionaire several times over, and the kind of good looks and star quality that already have some Democrats convinced that their party has discovered another Camelot. I think they like you." Senator Kerrey was born in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1943. He went to high school and college there, graduating with a degree in pharmacy in 1966. He joined the Navy, served in Vietnam, where his actions earned him a Congressional Medal of Honor. He started a chain of restaurants and health clubs in Nebraska and then served as governor of the state from 1983 to 88, after which he was elected to the Senate, where he is about to finish his third year of service, which includes service on two key committees, agriculture, which is most important to his state, and appropriations. Senator Kerrey, you will not always likely encounter in your campaign eager, interested audience who love the idea of government and politics, although I hear you had a great response in New Hampshire. But you do have such an audience here at the Kennedy School of Government tonight. We're honored that you've come. And would you join me, and please, in welcoming the Honorable Bob Kerrey, Senator from Nebraska. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What's the fire marshal say about all this here? Is there... My brief time in politics has caused me to see some rather unusual things. In fact, my chief of staff has a favorite motto, actually a favorite saying, that he occasionally applies to politics, and it has maybe some application. It was Groucho Marx who said that the two most important things in life are honesty and fair play, and that if you can fake those two things, you got it made. Well, we sometimes not only are accused of that, but regrettably sometimes are forced into that sort of living, and it does cause, I believe, people to distrust us a bit more than I think is warranted, given democracy's capacity to allow people to govern themselves and allow creatively them to establish institutions that had the capacity, I believe, to liberate human beings. I announced on a week ago Monday, and in Nebraska told the audience there that I've had a variety of experiences with my community and with my government that caused me to have mixed feelings. But the feeling that I expressed in Lincoln was that I had come home from the war in 1969, an altogether unpleasant young man, nowhere near as much fun as I am today. I came back from the war angry, embittered, and what the people of Lincoln did for me was to simply say that we care, we're your friend, and we'll try to provide you with some support. But more importantly than that, I believe, the people of the United States of America said, we're not going to measure whether or not we're going to get a return on our investment. We're not going to be just concerned about your capacity to produce. We're going to provide you with health care. We'll provide you with educational opportunity. And we hope that you're able to put your life back together. And what it's done to me as just one individual is it's allowed me to do a lot more than I otherwise would have been able to do. And instead of producing somebody who's dependent upon government, it's produced somebody who's grateful to America for what this nation has done for me. It is an extraordinary country that way, where one finds rather heroic acts occurring all the time outside of the not inconsequential glare of the spotlight, where one finds neighbors and friends willing to put it all on the line for someone else. Now, I believe as an individual that it's the highest act as an individual to look outside of yourself and say that there is somebody out there more important than I am, and that if necessary I will risk it all for them. And that when the preamble of the Constitution says to us that we're supposed to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and posterity, it is again the highest calling of this nation. It's what has made America great, our willingness to give to the future and to sacrifice for it, to put ourselves on the line for posterity and make sure that what we do today will make the future proud of our efforts. I'm very conscious, as I've talked in the campaign, that an awful lot of what I have today comes as a consequence of the gifts of my parents, who lived on and acted upon a rather simple value. They said that they cared more about 7 ungrateful, snot-nosed children than they did about themselves. They did not give with a sense that they were sacrificing. They did not build the interstate highway system with cash out of a sense that they were surrendering some of their income. They did not build schools that were the envy of the world and invest so that I had a productive economy in 1961 when I graduated from high school because they felt a burden. They simply loved their children enough that that's what they did. They simply cared enough about trying to make sure that I could raise my standard of living higher than theirs because they believed it was right to do so. And it was effortless in many ways for them to accomplish it. I'm very conscious as I stand in 1991 that many of those gifts have begun to lose their power, frankly because we haven't renewed them, frankly because we haven't been conscious of the need to try to connect with that future and give to it. And as a result, I've talked very often during the campaign thus far in the early stages about the need to try to build for the next generation and to try to make sure that we invest in the next generation, not just for the sake of investing, but the sake of conserving fiscal resources so that our children have a better opportunity, for the sake of conserving human resources so they have the potential to grow to their full potential, for the sake of saving natural resources because we understand that they're God-given assets to be preserved and enhanced. I've talked a fair amount about these sorts of things in the campaign. What I'd like to do tonight is talk about one element of policy that to me is critical. A foundational effort, not as a program to be offered in opposition to George Bush, who's not apt to offer much for our future. Not as a program to try to position myself in a Democratic primary, but because I've had real experience with health care as a service-connected disabled veteran, because I've had real experience in business as well with health care, and because I have had over 3 years of meetings and hearings at home talking to people about what they want to do, I have a rather dramatic proposal on the table that requires us indeed to change the way we finance so that instead of paying through premiums, we'll be paying through our tax system. It's difficult today. It's not a good time of the year, I suppose, to be proposing this sort of thing. People immediately want to focus on a tax increase. But indeed, the real challenge with health care in America is that unless we change the way we finance, our economic future is imperiled. I believe that the only way that we're going to be able to get costs under control is for us to be able to live in an environment where politicians can be held accountable for the expenditures, so that at the federal level we can have a national set of benefits and we can budget for health care and have some sense that we're going to get the cost of health care under control. Otherwise, what we will do is continue to graze the field. We spent 12.6% of GNP this year on health care. Germany spent 8%. Japan spent 7%. Our competitors at the national level are spending far less than we have with a completely comprehensive system of health care. We, by no stretch, have a comprehensive system available to all Americans. But the cost of health care can't just be seen on a national level. It's got to be seen as well on a business level. And for entrepreneurs starting in business, health care can be like property tax. You pay it whether you make any money or not. And particularly for a small business, it can be a tremendous problem, a tremendous economic problem with real human dimensions. Recently, the head of a small business here in the United States of America, Clayton Yider, the Small Business Republican National Committee, commented on a terrifying problem faced by all too many small businesses in America. Now, over 50% of the American people work for companies with fewer than 50 employees. I don't know how many employees the RNC has, but in this particular case, the terrifying situation was Lee Atwater coming down with cancer. It's not an unusual situation to have an employee with a very high-priced medical problem that requires an enormous expenditure and requires the business to have to make a Hobbesian choice. Do I keep the employee on the rolls where all the other employees are going to have higher payments for health care, or do I drop the employee from the rolls and let them then go to welfare or some other public institution to get paid? The RNC made, I think, the correct decision. They kept Mr. Atwater on the rolls. As lots of businesses struggle to do, they changed insurers, their rates went up, and they survived. Now, Mr. Yider said, of course, it has created a problem for some of the lower-paid employees who now have difficulty affording health care. And indeed, that's what we see over and over and over in America. The need to change health care in America is an economic need, not only as a nation, but also as businesses. People starting in business find health care today an enormous barrier, the cost of health care, the time required to price it, and the time required to try to figure out how to manage the care inside of your business, it seems to me, is not something that we can continue to do. But most painful of all for me as an individual, again based upon my own experience, I'm not arguing for socialized medicine. John Sununu suggested that I was arguing for socialized medicine. I'm not. He doesn't object, obviously, to socialized transportation. I don't know where his... I'm not arguing that government ought to own the hospitals and employ the doctors. It does work for me, and it does work as well for President Bush, who goes to Walter Reed. But I believe that we would lose some quality, and I'm arguing indeed for private health care. And for individuals still to be able to make choices. But the problem with the way we finance health care today in America can be seen worst of all at the individual level. What we are making individuals do in America not only makes no economic sense. Saying to the 24 million Americans who are working, if you've got a health care problem with your family, then what you have to do, you're best off doing, is quitting work and getting health care through welfare, as 27 million Americans now do. But we're also saying to working Americans that you're going to have to ration prenatal care, you're going to ration immunization, you're going to ration well baby care, you're going to ration those things that all of us understand produce long-term benefits. Now, we've got an environment today where individuals in our workplace in America do not have the proper incentive. Unlike myself in 1970, when the costs, by the way, were $300 a year and I thought I would live forever, and so it didn't seem to mind. In 1991, it's $2,500 per person, and the costs are going up even more rapidly than the rate of inflation. In 1991, what an individual faces is not a challenge to try to worry about their educational level, their job skills. Instead, what that individual faces is a prospect of having to go on to welfare and attach the stigma of welfare to their receival of benefits. We need to change the way we finance health care. I see it as a tremendous building block for an economic strategy to try to rebuild America. I see it as an enormous humanitarian benefit as well. I can picture America with this legislation in place worrying about what do we do to get healthy, not what do we do to pay the bills if we happen to get sick. I see it as a tremendous generator of new economic growth in this country. But most of all, what I see it doing is liberating human beings to worry about the things that they ought to worry about. And I see it as well pulling us together as a community to make us understand that indeed we're all in it together. What we've done in the 1980s is said, let me just give you one incident of a health care problem that's become a political problem rather than a health care problem. We've said with the health care issue of AIDS that local communities are going to fend for themselves. Even though we understand it's a national health care problem, we say to the local community, it's your problem. You figure out how to pay for it. You're the ones that are going to be charged with the responsibility. And as a consequence, AIDS gets debated as a political argument, not as a health care argument. We invest insufficiently in research. We come insufficiently with an insufficient urgency to solve the problem, and as a consequence, the problem simply gets worse. I'm not calling, in short, with this health care proposal for more spending. The status quo calls us to spend more money on health care. I'm calling for us to confront the institutional interests that surround health care and say, not only do we have to get costs under control, but we're going to change the way in which Americans become eligible for health care so as to liberate them from the fear of getting sick and free them to worry about other things instead. Worry about their families, worry about themselves as individuals, and indeed worry about themselves as businesses. I serve that up as an example of the sort of thing that I will talk about in this campaign. Now, I'm running for President of the United States of America because I believe that we need to consider the possibility of a renewal in America and begin to see new possibilities for us as individuals, new possibilities for us as families, and new possibilities for us as businesses. I grew up in the 1960s and the 1970s. I guess I was growing up by the time I hit the 1980s. Worrying about, was the next confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union going to be the one that would blow up the world? We lived under a cloud of fear that nuclear annihilation was just around the corner. We're beyond containment now. The fear of confrontation with the Soviet Union is almost non-existent. And what we will face in the 1990s is a much different challenge. A challenge that I believe will have us as a world trying to understand and figure out and cope with the problem of sustaining 5.5 billion people on this planet. We will have a confrontation between the developed and the non-developed world that will be exceptionally difficult for us to figure out. And in order for us to lead in that regard, we here in the United States of America, I think, are going to have to renew our institutions, and we are going to have to invest in our future, and we're going to have to do what may be the most difficult thing of all, and that is to believe simply that we can do it. I understand that the 1980s haven't been an altogether pleasant experience for people and their capacity to believe in the future. I know that we have had leaders who have talked about morality while they have winked at greed. Leaders who have said that they cared about American families while they cut the economic foundation out from underneath American families. Who have said that they care about balanced budget but never submit one, who say that the public institutions of this country are bad and they attack those institutions while they rob them blind. I know that we've been led by people who have wrapped themselves in the flag and wrapped themselves in motherhood by work and then turned around and worked hard to deny motherhood of choice and meaningful opportunities. I know that there's cynicism and pessimism in America, but I tell you, I look out at America and I see us still with enormous potential. Enormous potential if all we do is simply say that we are going to be fearless and giving ourselves to the future, to our children and to posterity. It is worth doing. It is possible for us to stand with pride in the year 2000 and feel as if we're making progress on some of the most difficult problems in America. To have a sense again that we're reaching out to those who are bent low from economic condition and are beginning to move them out of poverty. Begin again to have a sense that we're renewing the foundations of our infrastructure and allowing ourselves to be competitive in the world. To have a sense that we are having an attitude of conservation, not for the sake of simply conserving the resource, but for the sake of preserving and enhancing the future. I look into the United States of America today, and I'm extremely hopeful about what we can do, but I do see some significant areas of vulnerability. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan campaigned for president, he talked about a window of vulnerability. And many Americans responded to that. It was a vulnerability of nuclear weapons. We were vulnerable to the Soviet Union because we hadn't maintained parity in a certain classification of ballistic missiles that many people have long since forgotten. But today, the new window of vulnerability is our unwillingness to provide an environment for our children to make certain that they grow to their full potential. There is neglect in our neighborhoods. There's neglect in our inner city. There is a squandering of human resources that we simply cannot tolerate. Not only because we care as human beings for those lives, but because we also understand that it's an act of enlightened self-interest to change that environment. I don't think he's in the audience here tonight, but a member of the Harvard faculty, unfortunately not tenured, Robert Coles, gave me a book prior to my running, written by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And in Bonhoeffer's book, there is a quote that says essentially something that I think that we should allow ourselves to live. He said, "It may be that the day of judgment will dawn tomorrow, and if the day of judgment does dawn tomorrow, we will gladly stop working for our future, but not before." The most difficult thing that we as Americans face, and the most exciting, is the possibility of conquering our fear again and stare the future dead in the eye and say, we're going to build for greatness again. We're going to build that future so that we can stand out there proud of what we've accomplished. It will not require us just to come with an attitude of sacrifice. It will require us to come with an attitude that says that this is going to be fun, this is going to be worthwhile, this is something that will benefit not just me, but my family and my future. I want to thank all of you again for being kind enough to stand up there behind the lights. I would be pleased now to take a round of applause and then answer your questions.
Thank you, Senator Kerry. The ground rules are simple. They are simply to give you the map of the forum. There are 2 microphones up on this level. If you would line up there if you have a question, and 2 down here. The Senator will call on you. We have sufficient time for a lot of people to get questions in. The Senator's been very patient with us in giving us the time. Just try to keep the questions at a reasonable length so we can get as many people in as possible.
Yes.
I agree with you that one of the most important issues is health care, but one that everybody's been concerned about in the last few days and next week is the hearings for Judge Thomas. I was wondering what some of the considerations you would look into if you're president and had the opportunity to appoint a justice.
Well, I've appointed judges before, and it's always difficult when one has to do an analysis in a personal way, but that's essentially what you end up doing, because it puts you in a position of sounding as if you don't care for the person about whom you're making a judgment. But in this particular case, I would not have selected Clarence Thomas on the basis of competency, on the basis of just not being confident of the way that he would conduct himself on the bench. I fear that he would be reckless and not just overturning established precedents like Roe v. Wade, but other established precedents. I didn't end up the hearing, in short, with confidence that he would do a good job on the bench. Let's say further that what I think that we did in the Senate was to bend over backwards to try to be fair. I've heard some of my colleagues and friends on the floor talking about this smear campaign and this terrible thing of leaking the information out as if the public wasn't entitled to that information. The problem was that the information had to be leaked. What happened, it seems to me, is that we men got caught being extremely insensitive to a terrible problem in today's workplace, and we're going to get a lesson. Perhaps with political impact, but most hopefully for me, I hope that it will have an impact upon those of us who hire, those of us who have women working in our workplace. I think we have to be aware that what we're seeing right now is something that's not just a unique situation. Now, I'm not passing judgment on as to whether or not there was actual sexual harassment, but there's no question that we're now getting a window on the world of sexual harassment. We've heard people say, well, there wasn't sexual harassment because there wasn't touching. I mean, it's lawyers, prosecutors reaching that conclusion. Men, again, not understanding that sexual harassment doesn't have to be physical. Not understanding that sexual harassment in many ways can be worse than physical harassment because what it does to the individual's own thinking and what it can do to their possibility of advancing. Again, I mean, the foundation of this country is to say that we want to open up the doors of opportunity and give everybody an opportunity to move up. And sexual harassment shuts the door and causes people to live in fear of doing the right thing. So what we're going to see, I think, in the next couple of days will not be terribly comforting to men like myself who I think have gotten altogether too smug about sexual harassment.
On behalf of the Student Advisory Committee, I'd like to welcome you to the Harvard community and wish you luck on your campaign. But my question is this. In building for greatness, how do we reduce the deficit and how do we get the economy growing again? Tough question.
Well, in truth, it's not that difficult. I mean, it seems to me, although it's grown, that the deficit still is a relatively small bone caught in a great nation's throat. It's there as a consequence of political fear of what might happen if we do the right thing. I mean, that's what's driven it. That's what causes us to recoil in horror every time we walk to the edge, knowing that if we take action, people might get unhappy with us. My own view of it is that your question actually sets the stage rather well, in that I think the deficit must be viewed inside the context of our economy. This is not a mathematical argument. We're not simply reducing a number. This deficit is inside the context of the American economy. And thus what I believe we must do is be conscious that what we're trying to do is get the American economy to grow. What you're trying to do is make reductions, I think, on the spending side, and take action on the revenue side. My own health care proposal obviously has revenues with it, but the biggest thing that my health care proposal does is it says we will not deficit finance, we will not sell bonds to pay for doctors' bills and hospital bills. I mean, I may be able to make a case, and have on previous instances, that we should borrow money for roads or other long-term investments. I don't mind selling a bond to an investor if I have a sense that the proceeds of that bond will be used for something that will increase productive capacity someplace down the road. But we will sell $35 billion worth of bonds this year to write checks to doctors and hospitals for the federal programs of health care. And that will generate about $2 billion a year, somewhere in that range, of interest that might... Is this better? Is it getting hard to hear up there? Can you hear it? That my children will have to pay off. And thus, what I will look for on the expenditure side is those things that I believe do not contribute to growth in the economy. I think that what we are going to have in the 1990s is a tremendous opportunity as a result of the change in the Cold War and the construct. We will have an opportunity when defense expenditures comes down, and they most assuredly will. The fundamental question that we're going to have to ask is, what's our military structure look like? But under no circumstances is it going to be $295 billion. The only question is it going to be $275, $260? It's going to be significantly lower than where we are right now. And I believe that we should apply our energy to making sure that those investments that we're going to be making, that whatever peace dividend occurs, goes into transportation, goes into job training, goes into education, goes into things that will demonstrably, not hypothetically, but will go into those things that will demonstrably increase our productive capacity and increase our gross national product. I think in order to work our way out of this deficit, we are going to have to make some reductions in some items that I would describe affectionately still as pork barrel expenditures, but we are also going to have to look, as we reduce the deficit, for opportunities that will increase productive capacity. The health care proposal that I've got will decrease the deficit by some $35 or $40 billion, but it won't kick in until 94, 95. It will as well, in my reasoned judgment, be a stimulus to the economy. As a business person, I feel quite confident that businesses with a certainty of payment and individuals with certainty of coverage are going to have an incentive to increase their productive capacity rather than, as I indicated earlier, moving on to the ranks of welfare. With 1% growth in our economy, it's going to be difficult and short to reduce the deficit. And I just call to your attention again, as I said in my opening statement, that what we have to be is conscious that our future earning capacity is heavily dependent upon what we do today.
If I could follow up on your answer there, you were alluding to the fact that the budget really is divided into sort of a capital component and a current component. Are you willing to commit that if elected president, you would only submit and sign a budget in which the current component were in fact balanced?
No, I wouldn't. What I'm committed to do is move towards that as a goal. My fear in making a commitment like that is that I, once again, am conscious that this is not a political or a mathematical exercise. My concern is for the impact upon the economy. We have in motion right now some rather substantial, I think, short-term expenditures, but substantial anyway, that fall under the category of payment for past sins. We're going to pull 2% of our GNP this year to pay for the S&Ls. We'll likely pay another 2% next year to pay for it as well, and we're going to have those expenditures rolling out in the future. My genuine unwillingness to commit to something that I think is the correct objective. I believe what you've defined is the correct objective. My unwillingness to commit to it as an ironclad commitment is that I don't want to paint myself into a box and then find myself having to do something politically that makes no sense economically. Yes.
I'd like to ask you a question about the health policy proposal. As I understand it this evening, your proposal would have the government as an insurer providing some basic set of benefits for all citizens. We currently have such a plan in America called Medicare, which has had a lot of trouble just for our elderly citizens. While it provides a basic set of benefits, it does not provide many benefits that the elderly perceive that they need, and so they purchase Medigap insurance, further adding to their own personal costs for insurance. We also see that the Healthcare Financing Administration, when they try to create a zero budget so that the expenditures do not grow, are assuming that hospitals are going to increase their utilization as their reimbursement is decreased. We currently see, however, that urban hospitals are grossly overcrowded and that emergency rooms are having people not turned away but waiting for 8 or more hours and eventually leaving even though they need life-saving treatment. My question to you is in two parts. First, what is this? What is your basic set of benefits? Can Americans really define that, or do we all have a right to all of the health care that is currently available? And second, how will your proposal be different from the problems that we've seen under Medicare?
The second part is actually easier to answer than the first. I mean, the problem created with Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA, which are the three big federal programs for health care, is that we're constantly underfunding all three, which kicks a big shift over of under-reimbursed expenditures to private pay, so that I've got a double problem. One, I have no capacity as a politician to answer your question, how do I control health care costs? We do not have the capacity to do that. You cannot hold political representatives accountable for controlling costs. You can hold us accountable for controlling the cost of Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA, but the more that we're successful in doing that, all we're going to do is drive up the cost for private care even faster than the rate of increase for the other three. The most important reason for me to change this financing is to change the method in which one becomes eligible for health care. I begin with the principle that says that Americans have a right to health care, and that's how you become eligible. I follow by saying it's not an unlimited right. It's like all of our rights have limitations. The magical doctrine of relative rights determines that we stop when we bump up against someone else. My proposal says about a third of all health care expenditures will continue out of pocket. And I have a very specific set of benefits in the proposal. It's a guess. It's a guess, by the way, based upon lots of meetings in a very conservative state. In Nebraska, it includes long-term care. It includes home-based long-term care as well as institutional care. There are no deductibles or co-payments for any preventative care that's out there. It tries to force us to take preventative action with health care. It covers all acute visits to hospitals and to doctors. It covers dental care so long as it isn't cosmetic. It covers prescription drugs. It does have some co-payments in the system. They're less than what they are for Medicare, but there are co-payments in the system under the belief that that does contribute to cost containment. But the difference between this proposal and what Medicare, Medicaid, and the VA have, I use the VA as an example, we will become eligible for health care as a consequence of citizenship. Actually, I use under color of law. That's how one becomes eligible. You don't have to go to a war, God forbid, and get blown up in order to become eligible for health care. And what I believe strongly is, first of all, it gives us the ability to control costs, because now on the floor of the Senate, when we have a debate about benefits and we say, should we pay for liver transplants? We won't be asking the question about liver transplants for the poor. We'll have to say, and this may sound like we need this sort of thing, but we're going to have to say, will we, if we continue our current behavior, need a liver transplant at some point? That whatever health care decision we're making will apply to us and our families. And all of us, as a collective unit, instead of having a differentiated right based upon being poor enough, and as I said, we got a line of people queuing up to get into Medicaid right now, and the costs at the state level and at the national level are going up far greater than the rate of inflation and far greater than the rate of health inflation as well. But I simply say that Americans now will be out there working on their education and working on their job skills and working in a much different environment. And because of a second thing, this is much longer, I'm probably surprised that my answer could be longer than your question. But in addition, I do something that's rather important. I should point out, by the way, that I've got a very specific bill. You can look at the bill. Anyone who's interested in this thing, I'm trying to engage in a specific argument and a debate as to how we ought to do this. There'll be some that will object to the taxes. There are ways, by the way, to not do it with taxes. You can go to the German system and pay out into sickness funds and actually have decreased payments to the federal government. But we sacrifice substantial accountability by doing that. And so at this stage in the game, what I'm saying is do one budget and then distribute the management decisions back to the state level. Let the states manage the care. Massachusetts will manage care much different than in Nebraska. Both of us will probably manage it much different than out in California. The savings in this system, in my proposal, will spend $150 billion less than what President Bush wants to spend. We will spend $150 billion less by outside estimates than we will under the status quo. After we budgeted for savings, we will also have to manage for savings at the state and local level. And as I said, I think it will create an environment in America where we begin to talk about how do we become healthier? What do we do as individuals to control the cost of health care as a result of making efforts not only individually, but making efforts through our businesses and making efforts most of all to make sure that we aren't doing things to our own environment that are creating problems for our health.
Okay, thank you.
Senator. Oh.
Yes.
I agree that health care is a very important issue, but in the era of the 10-second soundbite, how are you going to sell your idea when it's competing against the Pledge of Allegiance and the flag?
Well, I'll recite the Pledge of Allegiance. If given the chance to do so, I will do as I always do and get very moved when the flag goes by and say that I love America as much as any human being. And then I got to roll up my sleeves and try to figure out how to make this country better. And I may not be able to get the work done in 10 seconds. I mean, the health care system in America is not going to improve if all we do is try to throw more money into it. It is not going to work that way. We will make, in my judgment, we may make matters slightly better at the margin, but overall we'll make them worse. Both for the country, for businesses, and for individuals. At this particular time, I happen to believe that Americans are getting squeezed very hard by the cost. They're a bit ahead of the national politicians on this issue. I spent a lot of time arguing it at home. I understand that people are nervous about the impact upon the insurance industry, the impact on some providers. And what I simply say in response is, look, one person's cost is another person's income. If I try to put together a group of coalitions, all of which say, terrific, this isn't going to hurt us, then I've got the wrong plan. I've got one that isn't going to work. I'm not trying to get 100% support for this thing. I'm looking for 50 or 60% support for it. So I expect opposition. Yes.
Senator?
Yes.
If I may change the topic to foreign
Sure.
policy.
Yeah.
You suggested that one way the United States can respond to the recent world changes, the end of the Cold War, is by strengthening our own internal institutions and by basically getting our own house in order. It's argued by some that the United States is the only world power with enough hard and soft powers to play a leadership role in the changing world of today. May I ask what your blueprint is for the United States in playing a role in the formation of the world after the Cold War?
I see three areas where the United States is going to have to lead. First of all, I would assert that the U.S. should lead, that we're needed in the world, that we can be helpful in the world, and that the last thing we should do in the 1990s is to celebrate the Cold War and isolate ourselves. It would be a mistake. It's not in our self-interest to do it, and it's not in the interest of the planet for us to withdraw. The three levels for me are, one, I think the U.S. does need to project force structure. Significantly less than what we have in the past. Nonetheless, our projection of power can create stability all by itself, and I'm willing to do that. Secondly, there are diplomatic efforts that are going to have to be pursued. We're seeing one in the Middle East. It's going to be critically important to continue to advance, to try to get a peaceful settlement between the State of Israel and the Palestinians, between Israel and their Arab neighbors. There's also going to be significant problems in the Southwest Asia region, in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet region, where new partnerships are going to have to be formed in order to produce stability, and new agreements are going to have to be established. And I think there's going to be significant diplomatic effort that's going to be required in Asia. So in addition to continuing to project force, I think diplomatic efforts are going to have to be made to try to use our power and our capacity to lead to resolve conflicts, whether it's the conflict in trying to get a peace agreement in Cambodia or trying to get a peace agreement in the Middle East. The United States needs to try to lead that effort. The last area is the most difficult, and that is in the area of economics. It's difficult because, again, it's hard to say in 10 seconds. But essentially, it's in the area of economics and economic trade. And because there's such unfair competition with the nation of Japan, they have almost an $80 billion surplus right now with the world, and other protectionist nations, there is an impulse to simply want to hit Japan hard just for the sake of hitting them hard. There's an impulse coming the other direction that says that what we ought to be trying to do is just establish free trade as a sort of a holy grail that we pursue as an end. And what I try to say, what I see us needing to do, is pursuing trade in the world as a means to an objective. And the objective ought to be to increase the standard of living and dignity of human beings, to improve and strengthen the quality of life in communities, and to improve and strengthen the quality of our environment. That is the objective for trade. It's not trade in and of itself as an objective, but trade to improve the quality of life of people on this earth. I say that because there will be a tendency for us to want to ignore the importance of allowing the non-developed world to participate in the international economic structure. There will as well be a tendency for us to say that why would we want to try to help the Soviet Union move to a market economy? Why would we want to try to help anybody out there in the world move to a market economy? Let's just take care of our own economy. As important as it is, I believe, for us to take care of our own economy, I think the object of that acquisition of strength should be so that we are able to continue to work to open markets and help the rest of this world raise their standard of living. And another way of saying it is the new international agenda, after you've taken the first two rather important ones, the new international agenda are going to be dominated by things that we haven't talked about as openly as I believe we ought to. Population control is going to be very high on the new international agenda. Conservation of natural resources, soil, rainforest, our own our unwillingness to set targets for CO2 as an international leadership effort, it seems to me is going to have to be reversed as well. We need to lead on environmental issues on this world. And finally, we are going to be plagued, I believe, with an increasing difficulty of trying to provide an environment for the children on the planet. But the overall question for us is, how do we sustain 5.5 billion people on a planet? That's a new challenge for civilization. Yes, we are going to have to continue to work for ways to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the proliferation of conventional weapons, and we're going to have to be alert to the hatreds and internecine rivalries that could create enormous problems for us. But we have, I think, above all things, have to understand that it is not accidental that we see a military coup and violence in Haiti. that there's a connection between economic status and political and social stability, and that when you've got $250 per person annual income in Haiti, you're going to constantly have political and social instability that will threaten us. And so it's in our self-interest, enlightened self-interest, to try to help the non-developed world develop.
Senator Kerry? Two quick and related questions. Number one is, if you were elected president, would you recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel? And number two, do you support the creation of a Palestinian state?
No to both. I do not think the United States should recognize Jerusalem as capital. I think that's provocative and ends up making it more difficult to get a negotiated settlement between the State of Israel and the Palestinians. And I don't think the United States should change the policy to have an objective, the creation of a new Palestinian state. I think that the objective needs, as it currently is, to be autonomy. I believe that the U.S. position needs to continue with 242 and 338, the United Nations resolutions that says that the West Bank and Gaza are territories that are in dispute and need to be settled with political agreements. It will be difficult for us to do that, but I think, in fact, the President is correct in saying that the United States needs to resist and oppose the establishment of settlements on the West Bank. I think it not only provokes increased disagreements, but makes it less, not more likely to get an agreement. But I also think the U.S. needs to make sure that we pressure all parties, that we don't unbalance our foreign policy in the Middle East, and we have sometimes done that on both sides. It will be very difficult for us to do to keep a balanced approach to the peace settlement in the Middle East, but I think it's terribly important for us to try.
How do you feel about delaying loan guarantees to Israel?
Well, I'd prefer not to have delayed the loan guarantees, but the President has asked for the delay. He now has the delay. I did not sign the Cast and Inouye bill that tried to pressure the President into delaying those loan guarantees. In the end, I think the difficulty with the loan guarantees will be that in America today, it will not have to do with the settlements. The difficulty of the loan guarantees will be unrelated to the settlements. What the President has not done, and what we are going to have to do, is come to the American people and explain that this is the final payment of a return of the people of Israel to Israel, and that had the Soviet Union not had restrictive immigration policies for 45 years, this immigration would have occurred without the need for this kind of a payment. Putting $10 billion of the loan guarantees out there for anybody's housing and jobs other than in the United States of America is a very difficult proposition right now. That's where the resistance is. The resistance will not be because of the inflammatory nature of the settlements inflaming the peace process itself and making the peace process difficult.
Thank you.
Senator Kerry, as Transportation Coordinator of the AIDS Action Committee of Massachusetts, I thank you for your comments about AIDS tonight. And unfortunately, my question to you also comes in two parts. The first of which is, what do you hope to do to combat the exorbitant prices of such drugs as AZT and DDI, which are the result of pharmaceutical monopolies over these products? And secondly, what I see among my clients is that sometimes the issue isn't even access to health care in terms of price or any of that, but actual getting there. And I think that's a problem for a lot of the infirm in this country, that they do not have the resources actually even to seek health care. And what do you plan to do about that?
Well, the legislation that I will introduce if I'm elected president will create an environment where that problem is likely to be solved, not just that particular problem, but other incidences where prices for pharmaceuticals or procedures are exorbitant. It will occur in a self-regulated fashion, I believe, most of all, because doctors and hospitals are going to be living within an overall budget, and they're going to have the opportunity to self-regulate, and I think that they will. Otherwise, the money will have to come out of their hides. It's a much better way of doing it, in my judgment, than for government to go out and try to regulate it, either from the top down or from the state level. One of the problems that I think that we've got right now in our current system is that in order to try to control the cost, we seek a regulatory mechanism to do it. and it sometimes isn't very effective. We just tried to do that with pharmaceuticals, saying to the pharmaceutical companies that if you offer a discount, a large discount to somebody for drugs, you've got to offer it to everybody else. They were offering a discount to certain state and local governments. Well, their response was something that we politicians hadn't thought of, which is not unusual. They just eliminated the discount for the people they were offering it to. So rather than reducing the cost for everybody else, we increased the cost for the one entity that was getting a discount. It's awfully difficult, I think, for federal politicians to be able to take action on cost control in that fashion without it producing some untoward and unexpected event. And so what I would prefer, and I think will occur, is that when we operate inside of a budget and we see that we're all connected on these expenditures, we're going to we'll get a sheet of the expenditures. I'm going to be asking, why are these things cost so much? Why are we spending $756 billion, which is what we'll spend this year? Next year in the campaign, I'll be saying to Americans, you're going to spend $840 billion in 1992. You spent $540 billion in 1988. Do you feel healthier in 1992 than you did in 1988? And I think Americans will say no. And what that leads to, by the way, is not just high cost associated with companies charging us too much, but it also will lead us to high costs associated with us doing stupid things. For example, there are $60 billion worth of health care expenditures that are there directly as a consequence of people deciding that they want to smoke cigarettes. Well, smoke them if you got them, as far as I'm concerned, but I don't want to subsidize the behavior. And what this will do, I bring cigarette and alcohol tax revenue into this health care fund so as to be able to keep the revenue down on other sides. Americans are going to find out that there's still some subsidy in there, and they're not going to like it. We're going to begin to get a connection. We'll look in areas where there is serious air pollution, and we're going to say, wait a minute, if I got a $15 billion expenditure that's fully preventable, shouldn't we be doing something to prevent it? And the answer is yes, and I think people will be incented to do the right thing. I don't know where you are today with seat belts in Massachusetts. I passed a bill in 1985, and the voters repealed it. Well, Nebraska doesn't want to have a seat belt bill? Terrific. We shouldn't have one. Maybe we can self-insure that risk. But I don't think that we should have traumatic injuries that are there directly because people aren't wearing seat belts and then have that activity be subsidized by the population at large. I think it will cause, I'm not talking about saying to patients we're not going to pay for you in this case. I think what it will do, this kind of an environment, it will create an incentive for politicians to do the right thing. And just as workers need an incentive to do the right thing, so do we. It doesn't hurt to consider that every now and then the politician might take the easy course of action. And we ought to create an environment where they take the right course of action. And this kind of a system that is fully accountable, fully public, where we see where the money is being spent, I think will create all kinds of healthy and good responses on the part of the politicians, up to and including, and I mentioned research on AIDS, that's not the only health care problem today that is underfunded in research. There are some less glamorous areas in research today that are being terribly underfunded. When we begin to get a connection and feel a personal responsibility between what we pay in and the benefits that are going out, I think it will cause us to do all sorts of things to consider what do we do to reduce those expenditures other than regulating and creating cost shifts as we were talking about earlier.
And the transportation component of the question?
Oh, God, I didn't get the transportation component. What was it?
Well, it is that very often a health care question, in addition to not being able to afford the actual treatment, very often the poor or infirm don't have access to centers.
Yes. Well, what I've done with this health care proposal is establish a specific resource development fund both for urban areas and for rural areas. I've also increased the funding for the Public Health Service Corps that has been punied up far too much in the 1980s. There's no question that in some cases delivery will have to occur. No question that in some cases that unless you make the affirmative effort to deliver care, that just changing the financing will not increase the access.
Thank you.
Right.
Senator?
Yes.
You mentioned a couple of questions ago the connection between political and economic stability in reference to Haiti. And I wonder if you might address the same issue in this country. Specifically, I'd like to know what proposals you would support to attack the problems of poverty, urban poverty specifically, and discrimination, and to what extent you see those problems as connected.
Well, I believe they are connected, but beyond, and I think that we need to do this, beyond civil rights and standing up to racism and discrimination as opposed to not just tolerating it, but using it in order to win elections. Beyond doing that sort of thing, it seems to me that that there are a number of things that can be done. I mean, first of all, I picture removing a substantial stigma from the delivery of health care with this health care proposal. You don't have to go to and meet a caseworker and prove that you're poor enough to be able to get health care, nor do we live in an environment where there's an under-reimbursement to the provider that tends to create, in some cases, hostility, in other cases, difficulty in finding somebody that will see Medicaid patients. My own view of it is that, that we've got to find 2 or 3 or 4 things that work, fund them, show the American people they can begin to make progress again. I'm thinking in particular of Head Start, where in many poor urban environments in particular, we are simply not providing full funding for Head Start as we should. The same is true with WIC. Housing, for me, is a terrific example. In fact, here in Boston, they've done quite a little bit, I believe, in trying to make housing affordable and available for low-income people. It's a great example of an intersection between a productive investment and a humanitarian response. It matters the kind of house that you live in, the kind of environment that you live in. It will create a different evaluation of yourself and will affect your ability to get up and go out and look for work. It will also affect the quality of development of your own children. And so for me, housing, job training, education would be quick follow-ons to a change in the way we finance health care. And the most, I keep coming back to this health care component, unless you do that, unless we change the way we finance health care, what we're left with is health care is going to be growing rapidly. It's growing faster than any other sector of the economy, and it is, to use a Midwestern expression, grazing into other pastures. And it's going to force out investments in housing, investments in education, and investments in job training. It's going to make it difficult for us to do it. So I do keep coming back to that. But what I would do as president is look for 3 or 4 things that we know work, where it's no longer in dispute. Liberals and conservatives both believe it will work, and try to fund them particularly in very visible ways and give Americans a sense that indeed we can begin to make progress, not just on urban poverty, but on rural poverty as well.
Good evening, Senator Kerry. Sorry, my question is it goes along with the previous question. Is last week New York City Mayor Dickens came to this forum and spoke to us about the federal divestment from urban areas in the past decade, and he called for an urban agenda. And my question to you is: do you have an urban agenda, and if so, what is it?
Well, I have certain elements of an urban agenda, but I would just directly respond to you. No, I don't come in this campaign with a specific, detailed urban agenda. I mean, again, you think I'm going to be running this horse of health care out every single time I've got a problem, but I'm sure you've, or perhaps you haven't, seen in recent days Governor Cuomo's proposal on Medicaid, and the proposal directly says to the city of New York, you have $2 billion worth of health care expenditures a year. There are now 1 million New York City individuals who live on welfare. A million, there's only 1.6 million living in the entire state of Nebraska. This has become health care has become a tremendous problem for urban environments and for city budgets, for county budgets, because we're essentially saying, you got indigent health care, figure it out on your own. You got localized health care problems, whether it's AIDS or other sorts of things, figure it on your own. So of all the things that I'm doing for the urban areas, the only one that I can actually attach as a part of an urban agenda is this generalized effort to change the way we finance health care. I'm prepared as well to come and say, I'd like to get involved with the city of Chicago school reform. I've visited it several times. I think they need a partner. They're floundering right now with the reform. It's slightly different than what I would personally like. It isn't perfect, but in fact the parents and the community leaders are trying to do something with their schools. Former Secretary of Education Bennett called it the worst school district in America, and then performing like the classic hit-and-run artist, he left town and hasn't been seen since. I mean, they are crying out for a federal partner. Perhaps we need to deregulate. Perhaps we need to give them more flexibility. But it's apt to be in the end where they're going to have to package some assistance of housing, some effort to work with what I see as a very progressive mayor that's trying to make changes and make sure things work. I think what we have to do for America is demonstrate that urban efforts can be successful. And I'm willing to come, whether it's Mayor Dinkins or Mayor Flynn or Mayor Daley or any other mayor. I can't think of one right at the moment that's a progressive Republican, but I'm sure they're out there who are trying, in fact, to make progress. What matters to me as an individual politician is results. If you've got a liberal program that will work, I'll support it. If you have a conservative program that will work, I will support it. What matters to me is results. And so if you've got political leaders that care about trying to reverse the decline in America today, I'm willing to play as a full partner. I will say as well in this campaign, one of the issues that's been in the presidential campaigns for the last 3 campaigns is the issue of crime. The Massachusetts furlough program became rather well known in the United States of America and influenced America's trust in the Democratic candidates' capacity on crime. The fact of the matter is what it was smokescreen. Because I will say to the United States of America that Republican policies on crime have failed. They've failed. Measure it by any standard. Any standard. We have now the death penalty on practically everything that an individual can do. We've got the toughest laws in the world today, where we are scrambling to provide resources and not getting it done. The prisons and jails of America hold 700,000 people and are growing by 7% a year. You don't have to be a wizard in mathematics to know that that'll double that population in 10 years. We are looking at failure in crime. And I'll ask Americans in '92, do you feel safer on the streets of your city than you did in 1980? And if you do, you live in a different city than the one I've been traveling in. The fact of the matter is we have failure in crime, and it's connected to the unwillingness to come to the cities and say, let's figure out what works and let's do what works, and let's give ourselves a sense that we can lift people out of the despair that has infected far too many lives in America.
Senator. Senator, my question is about your campaign strategy. I think it was the same Globe article that was quoted in your introduction that also suggested that formidable members of the Democratic Party not spend the good part of the primaries thrashing about amongst their own party, making mincemeat out of the Democrats, when they would better focus their energy on they would better focus their energy on the Republican challenge. What are your thoughts on consolidating your efforts, as this seems to be shaping up as the decade of consolidations and mergers, consolidating your efforts with what you think is your most formidable Democratic opponent and challenging the Republicans?
I don't know. It sounds good in theory. I mean, Paul Sanger is a very good friend. Tom Harkin is a very good friend. Bill Clinton is a very good friend. I don't know Doug Wilder as well, but I know him well enough to respect him. I think it's unlikely that you're going to see a lot of personal venom and blood shed in the primaries on the Democratic side. The fact is we're going to be underfunded. The President last week, the Republicans last week, did in something that I consider to be subversive to democracy. They fought a change in the law that will allow them now to go and bleed a rather small federal matching fund down so that guys like me with name recognition of 2 or 3% won't have much opportunity to have a level playing field. And so we'll have to, I'll have to fight somewhat differently. I'll have to carry the campaign somewhat differently as a consequence. My strategy is to come to the American people and say, look, here's what I would do. I know that you've got to trust that I can do good here at home, that I've got enough sense about me that I can keep the economy, not only keep it, but turn the economy so that it moves in a better direction. You've got some sense of what my experiences are, what I might do. You've got some capacity to predict, and you like what you hear or see here at home. You also have to trust that I can be your commander-in-chief, that I can negotiate with world leaders and do what I consider to be still an extremely important function as President of the United States. In the end, people are going to have to trust. And I've got to bring programs and I've got to bring policies, but I've got to do it in such a way that people say in the end that you don't frighten us, that we like you and will accept you and trust you and let you implement this change. And I know that I'm going to have to disagree with Democrats in the primary, and I know I'm going to have to disagree and do disagree with the President as well. But I think the real challenge for this campaign is is to really try to figure out what we want America to be. I mean, we have a tremendous opportunity post-containment, a tremendous opportunity to decide what we want this nation to be. And not only will it be difficult if all we do is get involved in blood wars between ourselves as Democrats, but it will be difficult to do that if assume I'm the nominee and I end up in a blood war with George Bush, he running $20 million worth of 30-second ads showing that his best friend is Norman Schwarzkopf and that he's got the capacity to lead in that area, or $10 million of the negative ads that asserts something negative about me. I mean, it's likely that that sort of thing could occur, but it won't serve the useful purpose of trying to engage Americans in a debate, which I think needs to occur, about what we want America to be, with pride in our future and the possibility for what we become.
Thank you.
We must end by 9:15, so we have 5 more minutes. Hopefully we'll get a couple of more questions in, but let's try to keep them brief.
Yes.
Senator, what is your perception of America's enlightened self-interest in terms of the transition in the Soviet Union, which is considered one of the most, or the most significant event in the second half of the 20th century, in terms of financial assistance, technical assistance, or emergency assistance?
Well, it is in our enlightened self-interest to help in this transition, both in trying to provide arguments that are foundations for the development of democratic institutions, in describing the need for the Fourth Amendment, for example, and those sorts of protections of freedom. It may be difficult for some right-wing members of the United States political spectrum to talk about the Fourth Amendment with great respect, but nonetheless, those are the sorts of things that we're going to have to do to try to help them protect freedom on an individual basis. And we have mature democratic institutions in the United States of America that provide us with an extraordinary amount of freedom. We have 100 years or more of case law that allows us to resolve conflict on property. They have no such case law present. We get very hostile towards our judiciary and towards lawyers as a profession, but the fact is we have just a very understated but important capacity to resolve conflict in America without worrying about your property being seized by someone who may have more strength than you do. And we're going to have to help them in that way, and it will require efforts like Mick Traynor bringing in Soviet military people, explaining to them that they don't have to worry about losing status just because they allow the civilian government to control the military. It's a very important part of a lesson that we learned over 200 years ago. It is in our self-interest as well to help them make the transition to marketplace, not only for the purpose of continuing to move towards the elimination of nuclear weapons, which we are doing right now, particularly of tactical weapons, but I think of significantly downsizing the need to have any at all, and removing that military tension from the face of the earth. But in addition to that, as I indicated earlier, the higher their standard of living in the Soviet Union, the more they're going to trade with us. And trade with an object of improving the lives of human beings and communities and the environment is good trade. Thus, some of the elements of Graham Allison here at Harvard's proposal for a grand bargain, so-called, to me make great sense. Leading the world community and providing a stabilization fund for a conversion, if not of a single currency, perhaps multiple currency, but some conversion, some convertibility is going to be required. I'm personally neutral as to whether or not it's going to be backed by gold or whether it will float, but they will have to be converted. Secondly, when they move from central pricing of goods and services to market-based pricing of goods, services, and labor, the potential for social and political disruption is enormous, not only from inflation, but it will be, I think, if they do the right thing with economic laws, that maybe 30% of the people will say we've never had it so good, and 70% will say we've never had it so bad, and we'll want to go back to the good old days of wherever it was that they came from. And we are conscious of that here in the United States, or at least we ought to be able to. I'll give you an assertion. I would put this out as an assertion that if in November of '92 unemployment in the United States of America is 10%, and God forbid that it will be there. I'm not a Democrat who roots for bad economic times. But if it's 10%, anybody could beat George Bush. That is an indication that there is a connection between economic status and political instability. And they don't have the structures of democracy that provide some kind of comfort that they're going to survive. In fact, there are so many nationalities inside of the republic, it's difficult for us to sort them out. And there are old blood feuds that are going to come out, and it's going to be difficult, even with good economic times, to resolve that conflict. Thus, I see an enlightened self-interest in trying to help them make that transition. Finally, some kind of effort, whether it's a guarantee, as Graham Allison described, or something in that category that allows us to assist in a more rapid transition away from military industries over into civilian industry, is clearly in our interest to do so. Now, we're going to have the same kind of challenge here in the United States of America, but it's going to be an easier challenge in a fully mature market economy than it's going to be in the Soviet Union. I mean, those are some elements of things that I think that we ought to be doing, not singularly, not as the United States all by itself. Our economic capacity isn't as great as some of our friends and allies right now, from whom we are increasingly indebted to. But I believe that we can lead it, because I think the United States understands the importance of doing it, and thus I believe that the United States should make that leadership effort.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Senator Kerry for an outstanding evening.